Ever. So who is the worst dinner host that you can possibly imagine? Now, if you are thinking at this moment of a specific person, I have to say that's not a great look. It's pretty judgy, gotta admit. Let me make my case that the worst dinner host that you could possibly have is one who is terribly sick, sneezing as they cook, wiping their nose, and not washing their hands, coughing all over the salad as they prepare it, right? Isn't that the worst dinner host that you can imagine? And I probably just changed your thinking about that. Now, some of you are still thinking of your mother-in-law. Shame on you. At Christmas time, we do a lot of eating together. It is the season in which we put on the most weight as Americans, and we will spend a lot of time having meals with people that we care about, friends and family, all throughout this season. Now, Jesus, throughout the Gospels, he spent a lot of time having meals with people. A lot of the Gospels center around his meals and feasts that he participated in. And so in this series that we're doing this month, we're looking at Jesus' meals that he has with people, the meals that he had with different people in anticipation of the celebration of his birth. And we'll culminate this whole thing on Christmas Eve morning as we talk about what it is for us to have a feast in his presence. But you may remember that we talked about a tax collector, Zacchaeus. And that's how we introduced this whole topic. Jesus finds Zacchaeus and says, "I must eat with you." Well, today we're going to talk about another tax collector, Matthew. And we're going to see Jesus' motivation in calling these tax collectors and his motivation in general as a whole. Now, he calls these tax collectors. That's what he does. And whenever I hear that word call, it reminds me of Romans 8:28. Now, you probably don't go there, but that's where I go whenever I hear that word call. Romans 8:28 says this, "And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose." So you see it there. You see why my mind goes to that verse whenever I hear that word called. And it's a great promise that's in this verse, isn't it? I mean, those who are called according to God's purpose have this really great benefit. God causes all things to work together for good. And that's what we tend to focus in on in that passage. Nobody ever really talks about the second half of this verse. We really love the part where God's, doing all the work and making everything turn out really well for us. But today I want to just consider the last half of that verse. For those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Now, you'll notice on the screen, I quoted the NIV, and those of you that know me know that I break out in hives whenever the NIV comes out. But I did that on purpose because the 1984, not the current version, but the 1984 version of the NIV actually is the closest to the sense of the Greek. Not the literal interpretation of the Greek, but the sense of the Greek in this passage. You see, the way the Greek is written in this passage, these two clauses, for those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose, are appositives. And you're saying to yourself, what's this? Appositives. For those of you where high school English was a long time ago, or your high school English teacher was not worth listening to, an appositive is a phrase in English that restates the object. All right? So, for instance, George Washington, the first president, established the first cabinet of the United States. Right? The first president is an appositive of George Washington. It's restating who he is. All right, so in Romans 8:28, we have this appositive. Those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. Those are appositives. It's not two different ideas. Paul is restating that those who love God are those who are called according to his purpose. Those who love God are those who are called. So here's what Paul is teaching. All those who love God are called by him for his purposes. And all who are called by him love him. This is what he's stating. That's ultimately how it works out in terms of the grammar. So everyone who loves God has been called. Every believer, every Christian is someone who is called according to God's purposes, which means there's a purpose to your call. You have things to do if you profess to love God. Now, there are a whole lot of things that we could say about that, but I'm just going to let that marinate. You just stew in that for a little bit, that you have a purpose and a calling in life. Because we're going to look at Matthew's calling in Matthew chapter 9. We see Jesus calling Matthew in verse 9. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. There's the call. What's amazing is that Matthew is called once. I mean, do you see it? I mean, you can look at the surrounding verses. There's no other interactions between Jesus and Matthew that are mentioned before this. Now, certainly, Jesus had become famous in Galilee, and that's where this takes place, probably Capernaum. Jesus had certainly been made famous before he met Matthew. He'd already, by this point in Matthew's gospel, he'd already delivered the Sermon on the Mount. And several times before this, Matthew mentions that Jesus is followed by a great crowd. I almost said cloud. A cloud of witnesses, I guess. He's being followed by a great crowd. And so Matthew certainly knew of Jesus. He would have been the talk of the town, I think. But Jesus simply says to him as he's passing by, as he comes near to Matthew, he says, "Follow me." That's Matthew's call. And Matthew gets up, leaves his tax collecting booth, and his life is completely and totally and absolutely and forever changed. He never goes back. Here's how you know when you've been called. When you start to get this growing sense that Jesus has to be the most important part of your life. Everything else then has to take a back seat. It's a realization that nothing is more important than your relationship with Jesus. And you realize that you've got to give him control, and everything in your life has got to revolve around him. He's the gravitational center around which your whole life revolves. That's the call. It's a complete priority list overhaul for you. Because that's the only way that you can do what Matthew does. Leave your vocation, a good, lucrative vocation, completely leaves it behind to follow somebody that you only just met. It makes no sense as a rational thing that you're thinking about. That's the call of God in your life. You take Jesus home. We talked about that last week with Zacchaeus, where you live. You take him to where you live, those most intimate, innermost parts of your life. You take him home to that, the very center of your life, where all of your priorities are. And you let him start reshaping those priorities to his taste, on his direction, with his priorities. Not because you have to, not because you're obligated to, but because you want to. That's the call. That's what Paul means when he says, to those who are called according to his purpose. So for Matthew, it means the things that you were doing, all those other things that you used to be doing, they no longer matter. You just get up and you walk away from them. It's a whole new vocation from here on out. Now, I need to qualify this. Unless you think everybody's got to quit their job, they got to start, going in, Africa or something like that. It may be that that's what God has called you to do. But that's not how everyone receives the call. It's not, God doesn't call everyone to quit their job and to go somewhere else. In fact, some people will be called to live out their relationship with Christ in their work and through their work. They won't leave their job. Oh, let there be light. God, you should have warned me that you were going to do that, Matt. I could have had that totally timed out. Thank you, Matt. That is fantastic. All right, where was I? I forget now. Some will be called to live out their relationship with Christ in their work. They won't leave their job. and their work won't effectively change. However, what they do in their work will absolutely change. The priorities and goals and vision that they have for why they're doing what they're doing will be because of who Christ is and what he's done in their life. However it works out, being called means that you are no longer in control. The reason why you work now is a completely different reason. Because you want what he wants you to do and be and live, and the way he wants you to do that in your life. So take Zacchaeus, who we talked about last week. We said last week that his repentance was a sign of his salvation because the reordering of his priorities went along with it. If I've defrauded anyone, I'm going to give back to them 400% of what I took from them. He says that's the blessing. He wants to bless others. That's the call in his life. That's what Jesus called him to. His priorities were all reorganized. That's how we know the call was on his life. And the way it works out in our passage is that Jesus comes near to Matthew, and Matthew follows. And that brings Jesus more opportunities as he enters into Matthew's circle of influence. The passage says, verse 10, picking up, and as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Now we have to assume the house is Matthew's house because, one, he's the author, and he just introduced that he's following Jesus, and then immediately says the house. There's no other house that it could be, looking in it in context. So the calling of Matthew allows for this dinner party to happen at his house. And this is what Jesus is here for, to begin with.